Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Megsy, and today I will be doing my July wrap-up. I read a total of 7 books. I have about 4 of them here, and I do kind of long book reviews if you are new. I read all, I guess, literary fiction, you could call it, this month, and the common themes are usually about lonely men, lonely women, people coming of age, sprawling family sagas, and satire about very bleak circumstances. So if any of those sound interesting to you, please stick around and we will get started. So the first book I finished in the month of July was Hotel du Lac by Anita Brookner. Now, this was a reread for me. I read this, I think, back in 2010. And so I really didn't remember much of any of it at all. I had talked about this book in my Books Like White Lotus video because this book does come up as like books that have this sort of the same vibe, that take place on vacation or on a retreat at a hotel with a whole cast of characters. And yes, I can see why the gist of this novel would fall into that category in terms of like lists that people came up with. Is it like White Lotus, though? Otherwise, in terms of the vibes, not really. This was published in 1984. I'll get back to that in a minute. So it follows the story of this woman named Edith Hope, who is a romance writer. And she takes a little retreat to this hotel in Switzerland. After her personal life, a couple things go wrong, particularly a certain kind of event where she is extremely humiliated. And while she's there in this hotel, she interacts with all of the people who are staying there, who are regulars, and some of the staff. And everyone there is sort of like an outcast in various ways. There's a lot of people there who, like Edith, I think she's in her late 30s, who are a little bit older, even older than her. So everyone, I guess, is essentially, past their prime. And the character Edith, she ruminates a lot on sort of what led up to her fleeing to this hotel for a kind of sanctuary. We see her, she writes letters to this man she is having an affair with. He's a married man. So I've mentioned this before when I talked about Anita Brookner, that what I remember about her was that she was really good at, or fixated at least you could say, on writing about women and loneliness. But it's not like contemporary sad girl literature, because Anita Brookner, I think she was born in the 1920s. So the closest way I can describe this, and I do remember this same kind of vibe with the only other book of hers I read, which was Look at Me, is it feels like spinster literature. That's how it feels like. Edith, in this story, and this is what drove me nuts about the story, was the main character Edith has very much a lot of internalized misogyny. Particularly, she's very judgmental of other women. And I feel like she views women in this sort of Madonna horror complex, wherein women are either these hysterical, manipulative hussies, or they are like her, the long-suffering spinsters. And Edith is in the latter category, and she feels like she has this, I think, air of moral superiority, even though she's the one that's been having an affair with a married man. And so that, to me, kind of drove me bonkers, because I really disliked her. I didn't like the main character. And despite the fact that this was published in 1984, the social mores of the time, like of how women should behave, and like, oh my God, like, you're an unmarried woman, oh no, it felt very dated. It felt much more dated than the 80s. It felt like this took place in the 50s or maybe like early 60s. And so it wasn't really clear to me when I was reading this if the novel was actually supposed to be set at the time period in which it was published, or if it was supposed to be earlier. That was not clear. It was fine. Like, the pacing is very slow and then it picks up, but I think it just, for me, it was just, I did not like the main character's constant, like, sad sack, self-pitying self. So I would say it's like 3.5 stars, 3.75, I rounded up. I didn't dislike it. I think the writing is decent, like I said, but yeah, I think it was just the main character kind of like ruined it a little bit for me. So is it like White Lotus? Not really. I feel like I'm not really having much luck finding stuff like White Lotus. The next book I read in the month of July was kind of a little bit in a similar vein about now a lonely man. So we're moving on from femcells to incels, and that was Madonna in a Fur Coat by Sabahattin Ali. I hope I'm saying that right. This is a classic work, a classic Turkish work that was translated to English by Maureen Freely and Alexander Dawe. And this was published in 1943, and it came out, I think, the English version came out in 2016. Okay, so this book is so much, I feel, in conversation with this book, but I feel like this one is a little bit more progressive, which is kind of shocking. So this is a story about a lonely, bitter older man named Rafe, who is on his deathbed, and he gives his coworker his secret black notebook. And essentially the entire duration of this story is the coworker reading this notebook about Rafe's youth when he went to Berlin on an apprenticeship and met his first and only love there, a woman named Maria, who was a cabaret singer. Now, this takes place in the 1920s. And he first spots Maria, not in real life, but in a painting. And is a painting in a museum, and he goes and he gazes at this painting every single day. And one day, Maria, she's been watching him, and she comes up to him and she's like, "You come here all the time and stare at this painting." Totally not creepy. And they end up beginning a romance, a short-lived, tragic romance. But like I said, it is a tragic tale because, of course, Rafe, when we flash forward to the present, he is a lonely, bitter, older man. He's married and has a family, but he never got over Maria. And so his coworker learns the true secret of Rafe's internal world and what makes him tick. That's essentially the plot. This actually reminded me of Isabella Hammad's The Parisian, which is about a Palestinian man around the same time period, actually I think 1910, so a little earlier, who goes to Paris for medical school and falls in love with a French woman and then has to move back to Palestine and take care of the family business. And, he always thinks of this lost love. And so that book obviously was published only 6 years ago, so I can see where Hammad took inspiration from that, probably from this novel. Now, this was interesting. This was an interesting book to read, sort of about the gender dynamics, particularly when it was being published, like, prior to World War, well, it was published during World War II. During World War II. And so Rafe, I feel, is essentially like a proto-incel. Like, he is so bitter and lacking in social qualities. He doesn't really know how to interact with people, how to really connect with them. And he puts Maria on a pedestal. And I mean, that's essentially like how he first sees her, is literally just through a painting. She's not even real. And it's almost like even when they do embark on this love affair, she's always just sort of idealized as this image in his mind. And he also is like very entitled too, and very jaded. Maria, for her part, though, I have heard some people online said that she was like a proto-manic pixie dream girl. I disagree with that. I think that what surprised me about this was that Maria was surprisingly self-aware, and she seemed to be very self-aware about how certain kinds of men can act and treat women and what they demand of her. And she essentially doesn't hesitate to call men out for their treatment and behavior, despite the fact that she gets involved with this guy. And so I kind of disagree with, I think, some of the interpretation that she is just a blank canvas, because I felt like she was a little more fleshed out, at least in a way that I was pleasantly surprised by, not just for the time period, but to be written by a male author. I think it was solid. It was good. I would rate it, again, like another like 3.5 stars, rounded up, I would say, to 4 stars. I do like to break up my reading by reading novels that were published from quite a long time ago, because it's just funny to read about read about like how people would write about romance and relationships and even sex. Like, sex is so alluded to in this, but like I had to reread one of the passages because I was like, wait, did they actually have sex? Everything is just so vague, and it's so wildly different from the modern era. So yeah, I mean, I think it was a solid book. And if you're interested in like classic Turkish writing, I would recommend it. And I also think the cover, by the way, is really pretty too. The next book I finished in the month of July was James by Percival Everett. I haven't read anything by Percival Everett. I have seen a film adaptation of his work, American Fiction. This was my first time actually reading his stuff. My friend lent me this book over the 4th of July weekend. So this is a satirical retelling of the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but is from the perspective of James, Huckleberry's family slave. And it has a very kind of dark, satirical humor to it. Now, I have read slave narratives, you could say, historical fiction that deals with people who were living under slavery, the antebellum era, whether it was like Beloved by Toni Morrison or The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates, which I reviewed a couple months ago on this channel. But this is quite different because the tone is very different. It's still quite dark, obviously, talking about slavery, but there's a kind of distance, I feel, that the reader is held at from the characters and also from just the events going on. And I think because of that, and because of the fact that it is satire, it's still disturbing, but it's not quite as bleak, if that makes sense. The thing, too, is that this novel is a very quick read. There's not a lot of, like, descriptive writing, I guess you could say, like, expository writing. There's a lot of dialogue. And so I read this in, like, a day, literally. Like, I read it over the weekend because the dialogue is so much of the bulk of the novel. Now, I never read The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, so I don't know how much it diverges from it. But essentially the plot is that James is going to be sold, and so he will be separated from his wife and daughter, and so he runs away. And then meanwhile, Huckleberry Finn also escapes his family because his dad was abusive, and so they go on this traveling journey, and James hopes to buy his wife and daughter's way out of freedom. Jim, his formal name is James, is self-educated. A lot of the slaves are, and so they talk in this kind of code switching where when they are around white people, they talk in this standard like slave slang, and then when the white people aren't around, they talk in much more like standard English, and they pretend to act more uneducated than they really are because, back then it was illegal for a slave to know how to read and write. And so I liked also, there were these certain like dream sequences where Jim he has dialogue with these like great 18th century figures like Voltaire, who were sort of held up as like the pinnacle of like Western Enlightenment. And he's in one scene he's having like a dialogue with Voltaire, and Voltaire, he talks about like the subject of slavery, and Voltaire's like, oh well, it's complicated. And Jim's like, excuse me, what are you talking about? And Voltaire's like, well, I'm an abolitionist, I'm on your side, but and then he spews some like sort of race science. And I thought it was like a good indictment, I think, of like Western liberal hypocrisy, you could say. I think that's what Everett is kind of getting at. I enjoyed this, honestly. It was such a quick read, but, just a heads up, like, don't go into it expecting, like, a somber, unflinching story of, like, a standard historical fiction slave narrative, because it's not really that. It honestly does remind me, I haven't seen the film, but I've seen clips of it, of Django Unchained. This goes from Mark Twain to Quentin Tarantino in parts, particularly at the end. That's all I'm going to say about that. I don't know if it's like 100% historically accurate, and some liberties might have been taken, but yeah, I would recommend it. And I do want to check out more of his stuff. I would actually like to read Erasure, which is what American Fiction was based on. So I would rate this 4 stars. The next book I finished in the month of July was The Blind Assassin by Margaret Atwood. This was another reread for me, but it was kind of like I was reading it for the first time, because I probably read this in the late 2000s and I really didn't remember much of any of it. This is a sprawling 528-page novel that jumps around in time. There's about like 3 different plot lines that are in different time periods going on at the same time in this. So we follow this woman named Iris, who's an older woman, like the turn of the century, and we learn that her sister was a famous novelist. Her sister published one novel. It was found and published after her death, and a couple days before her 25th birthday, this sister, her name was Laura Chase, drove her car over a bridge deliberately. So we are in 3 different time periods in this novel. The present, which is when Iris is an old woman and kind of reminiscing about the past and going about her day to day. We have the up from like the 20s through the 40s of Laura and Iris's whole life story together. Their family owned a factory that like produced buttons, and so the 2 sisters grew up very wealthy, but not necessarily in a happy environment. And then we have a nested story that takes place, we presume, in the 30s or 40s, where a man and a woman meet clandestinely, and as they meet in these different hotel rooms, they are telling a science fiction story together that is takes place on another planet with like an invading army, that whole kind of thing. This novel it's so long, and I felt like a lot of it could have been cut. I felt like my interest in this novel kind of waxed and waned. There were parts that were interesting, and then there were parts that just had like extraneous pages of minute detail that just were not relevant, that just could have been cut, honestly. I think there was too much time in the sister's childhood that doesn't really add up enough to too much time. I think that like we get enough of the characterization, right? We didn't really need that. I think another area that could have been cut was the time in the present where Iris is an old woman and she's just like doddering about her day to day, and she's like losing mobility. And I didn't think that was really, because it was kind of getting repetitive. Like it was just sort of the same. And I felt like just chunks of that could have also been cut. And so I think one of the things about this story is that Iris as a person and her personality, so much of it was based in contrast to her sister Laura, that I felt like Iris didn't really exist as a person on her own. Like, her personality was just so blank. She was just so passive and just go with the flow, and only defined in relation to her sister, who is very defiant, inquisitive, you know, that typical, like, the girl who's maybe too smart for her own good. She's the sort of like mentally ill bad girl, and of course, you know, because it is Atwood, well, something is going to happen to her. And I think that, well, the writing is pretty solid. You know, Atwood is undoubtedly a talented writer. I think sometimes the way she writes certain characters can feel like tropes. And you don't notice it initially because the writing is really, you know, pretty strong, and you know it's good enough to mask that. But when you're thinking back and you step back and analyze it, you see that. And it's not just like in the two sisters, it's also in the men in the story too. So Iris's late husband Richard, he plays an integral role in the story, and then also there is this man named Alex who was Laura's love interest, and these two men are sort of defined again in like opposition to each other. Richard is he takes over the family business essentially, and he's like the greedy capitalist and like a fascist sympathizer. And then Alex is like the poor vagabond who is also a communist who is consumed by envy of the rich. It just kind of felt like a little bit like they felt like political tropes, you know what I mean? I will say, though, on a side note, I did like the fact that even though Atwood is a liberal, she's not a leftist. I feel like she knows enough history that she knows businessmen will always side with fascists over communists. And I was actually kind of pleasantly surprised that she understood that in the way she made Richard sympathetic to Nazi Germany. This book was okay. I think it just dragged in parts. It was too puffed out. It's not bad, like I said. It's not something I would want to reread, and I think I can kind of see why a lot of it I didn't really retain, because there's so much extraneous detail that is not really necessary. And I don't know if I would now I have to go back and recant this. I don't know if I'd really relate this, or I don't know if I would necessarily recommend this as one of Atwood's best. I think maybe I may have just outgrown her a little bit, you know, it just happens. I have other books of hers and I might reread them, I might not, but yeah, this is just it's just like a 3-star for me. The next book I read was Good Girl by Aria Aber. This was released this year, and it was shortlisted for the Women's Prize in Fiction. So this is a story of a young Afghan German girl named Neela who is coming of age in Berlin in the early 2010s. And she is this creative type. She is an aspiring photographer, but she is also a party girl, and she likes to go clubbing and take copious amounts of hard drugs and be on mind-bending substances while thinking about philosophy and the meaning of life. I actually was initially very skeptical of this because I thought that it felt, what I knew about it, what I'd read about it, it seemed very much like a standard millennial, troubled woman, sad girl kind of novel that is very autobiographical and was sort of molded into a novel in a way that should have probably just been published as a memoir. But I was pleasantly surprised because I do think that she was able to shape this story into a novel with a cohesive plot. And it didn't really read like metafiction to me, even though, like I said, I think a lot of it is very autobiographical. A large part of this story, just as a trigger warning, does deal with Neela's relationship with an older man. Neela is 19, and she gets into this relationship with this 36-year-old washed-up American writer named Marlowe. And this guy is just I mean, he is just awful. He's essentially like a Hunter S. Thompson kind of character who never grew up. And I do think, though, that the relationship and Neela's feelings for Marlowe were done really well. I think it does a really good job, the novel, of portraying power imbalances in relationships and emotional manipulation. Like, Marlowe is so scummy, but he's still a fairly fleshed out character in a way that doesn't feel like a one-dimensional cardboard cutout. Because I think sometimes when people write about predators, they're so black and white because, like, people are afraid to portray them in a more realistic manner because they're afraid that that will, like, garner sympathy. And I don't think that's the case at all, really. I think it's realistic. I was a little skeptical initially of the writing because Aria Aber is a poet. This is her debut fiction novel. And I was sort of like, oh God, I hope this... Sometimes when poets turn to novel writing, it comes out in this very, like, overwrought purple prose way. And I didn't really think the writing was like that at all. I think that she's really good at capturing not just, like, the essence of characters and relationships, but also of place. I mean, I have never been to Berlin, but I feel like she really painted, like, a really dense portrait of, like, the nightlife there, but then also the ghettoized immigrant communities and all of the xenophobia and racism that they face. And the thing that really struck out to me in this novel was how, like, the shadow of the Holocaust in Germany just sort of looms in the background. And Neela, coming from an Afghan background, has this, you know, intrinsic knowledge that being a member of she's a member of a visible minority that has sort of become like the new scapegoat for Germany's visible other. And I think it was a really unsettling portrait of how Germany never really denazified, and just how, like, over time, and this is not just limited to Germany, of course, the hated minority group of the moment changes over time. So overall, I thought this was a really solid debut. I was really captivated by it. I read it very quickly. People have compared it to Kaveh Akbar's Martyr, but I think that the writing was a little better, honestly. I don't think that, and I think the plot was more cohesive as well. So yeah, overall, I would definitely recommend. I would rate this 4.5 stars. The next book I read in the month of July was Milk-Fed by Melissa Broder. This was the third Melissa Broder book I read, finishing up reading all of her fiction books, and it was definitely my least favorite, which I wasn't surprised because that's why I saved it for last. So this is a story of a young woman named Rachel who has an eating disorder and a very toxic relationship with her mother. And at the suggestion of her therapist, she does a 90-day detox from her mother, going no contact. And her mother is actually one of the reasons why Rachel has an eating disorder in the first place. When she was growing up, her mother was very critical of Rachel's body. So naturally, Rachel developed an eating disorder. And so Rachel goes to this froyo place and one day after work, and there she sees this woman named Miriam. Miriam is an Orthodox Jewish woman. Rachel is also Jewish, but she is more of a not really practicing, just more like culturally Jewish. And Miriam is also very overweight. They begin this sort of secretive relationship wherein Miriam is interested in feeding Rachel, feeding her very rich, heavy meals. And yeah, it kind of goes off from there. To be honest with you, I didn't really care for this. I rated 3 stars, but I'm not sure. Okay, let me start with what I liked. I'll say the positive thing about Broder's writing. Her writing is very easy and accessible to read. I think it can be very fun. She has a very dark sense of humor. She can make fun of the most bleakest of circumstances, right? And there's some kind of humor in there. But like, I just felt this book was a mess. It was such a mess. And I think it was like under 300 pages. And for being under 300 pages, I felt like there was a lot of themes that were not properly explored. Maybe shouldn't really have been touched with. There's a lot of like weird, gross stuff in this too, like excessively gross. You have like, okay, you have eating disorders, but then you have like incest fantasies. That's all I'm gonna say about that. Okay. You have fat fetishization and, you know, queer women's identity and shame and Jewish cultural identity and religious identity and all that kind of stuff. It's like a lot. I thought that there's parts of this, like the writing, there is a dream sequence in this novel as well with like a 16th century rabbi. I'm not going to really even explain that, but there's parts of this that read sort of rough drafty. And I thought that way too about Death Valley. However, I felt that Death Valley, the themes in it were more interconnected and they weren't so bogged down with all this like heavy, I mean, it was heavy, but you could see where she was going with it, right? And this was just kind of like all over the place, and I did feel like it was leaning a little too much into shock value. I don't know if I really liked the way Miriam was portrayed. I don't think that this novel is very sensitive to fat people, and I think it kind of perpetuates harmful stereotypes that like fat people just eat whatever they want and they're all jolly and happy and fat, and that's sort of like they have like no self-control. And that was sort of like what Miriam was. Like, she had no, like, she was very carefree. She had no self-control. Nothing really bothered her, you know, even like living within like a very conservative Orthodox environment, and her not being able to even really live outwardly as a queer woman. That doesn't really seem to like bother her too much. Like, she's very innocent, and she's the opposite of Rachel, who's like very rigid and constrained. But I feel like that again kind of perpetuates harmful stereotypes of like fat jolly people, right? And I felt like she was sort of fetishized. She was fetishized as like this like fat manic pixie dream girl. I feel like when I read this, I don't know, I think some of it might have been a nod to Philip Roth's Portnoy's Complaint, which maybe would make sense why I didn't like it. I mean, yes, it is from a woman's perspective. It's from a queer woman's perspective, so maybe Broder was trying to like reclaim that, but I don't know. There's just some weird stuff going on in here. Like, Rachel has this sort of fetish of like, well, she has a lot of fetishes, but one of her fixations is like, because Miriam is this like manic pixie dream girl, so to speak, Rachel just like really has this idea of like wanting to corrupt Miriam and like beat her first. And it just was, there's something about it that was just icky. I felt like overall, I think my problem with this was that this book, I felt like we didn't really transcend these stereotypes. Instead, we just sort of sat in them without challenging them. So this was just my least favorite. The ending felt very rushed. There was a lot of stuff that was just not wrapped up. And I don't think that this was her intention, but it kind of feels like eating disorders are not just a phase. They're a lifelong struggle. And so for me, the idea of like getting in a relationship with someone who wants to take care of you or like feed you lavish meals, that's not going to cure your eating disorder. And that's sort of like what the book kind of implies. And I don't think she meant that, but I think because, again, this book was just not fleshed out enough, it kind of goes in that direction. But I don't really want to spoil anything. So I'm not sure what to rate this, because it's maybe like a 3-star, 2.5-star, 2.5 to 3-star, but it is definitely, of her 3 fiction works, this is my least favorite of Broder's. And then the last book I read in the month of July was American Appetites by Joyce Carol Oates. this is the like 24th Oates work I've read. I've kind of been interested in exploring her older stuff that I hadn't actually read before. And so this was published in the late 80s. And like a lot of her works, it takes place in a sort of like academic upstate New York setting. It is, I would say, like a domestic fiction, domestic suspense, has kind of like a thriller element slightly to it, but in that like literary fiction way. It follows the story of a 50-something couple, Ian and Glynis. They are these like upper middle class white yuppies in the late 80s, and Glynis, I think, teaches, and Ian works at this like think tank. We don't really know what they do exactly, and they're like very well respected in the community, and they have these really lavish dinner parties with other intellectuals of their social standing, where they all drink a lot and gossip and are all cheating on each other and sleeping around with each other's spouses. And one day Ian gets a phone call from a young woman who was an acquaintance of Glynis, very briefly, and Ian goes and helps this woman out. She's in a bad place with her partner, and he gives her some money, and then he kind of like keeps in contact with her over the coming year, but nothing ever comes of it. They don't have an affair, even though he certainly thinks about it, and he never tells his wife anything about it. And then one day, Glynis discovers this canceled check that he had made out to the woman, and so they get into a big fight. And this sounds like a spoiler, but I assure you it's not. It's on the back cover. They get into a fight, and he pushes her through a window, and she dies. Okay, so that's the story, because then he goes to trial, and his whole standing within the community is ruined. And yeah, it is very much, I think, Oates is kind of making fun of the sort of like upper middle class white yuppies of the era, these like academic, liberal, academic types. I enjoyed the writing. It's quite, how long is it? I think it's around like 400 pages. But I could tell reading this that it was written from like a different time period, like it wasn't a modern book, and that's not a slight at all. I just feel like what is missing from so much modern literature is expository writing. And I felt like the way she talks, the way Oates writes about the different kinds of characters in this story, and all of these certain kinds of marriages, and the way people present in outwardly to their community versus the way that they act behind closed doors, and that discrepancy, it's really well done. It's quite messy. It's a lot about like rich white people's mess, and it took me by surprise. I mean, the ending is definitely kind of takes a turn. You're not quite expecting it, but I would recommend it. It actually reminds me of The Staircase, which is, the actual crime, that the documentary and then later the reenactment of it, which I recently watched, happened, I think, like 20 years or something after this, or 12 years maybe, after this book was released. And so it's so funny how it actually mirrored a real life case, but it happened before that case. So yeah, I think it's not like in my top 5 of Oates's work, but I would say it's probably above like mediocre for me in terms of like if I had to rank every single one of her works that I've read. So I would rate this 4 stars. 4 stars. I thought it was pretty solid. There are some, of course, because Glynis wrote cookbooks, there are some like very long trailing depictions of food for me that I'm not like really a fan of that. So in the beginning with like dinner party scenes, it was a little bit too much, but overall I enjoyed this and I thought it was pretty solid. So yeah. And yeah, that's it. That concludes my wrap up of the month of July of 7 books. And please let me know if you have read any of these books, or you want to, or what you read in July. Please comment, like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.